Shruti ji, we will wait for a couple of minutes if you don't mind.
Sure.
We have always this starting problem. So.
No problem. No issues.
Yeah. Anand Bhaiya, namaste. Anand Bhaiya, namaste. You're on mute.
Good morning, sir.
Good morning. Anand Bhaiya, I could hear your few words.
Yeah, I can hear you.
Oh, okay, good.
Right.
So, how are you, Bhaiya? Long
better.
time.
Yeah. Recovering. Yeah. Go ahead.
Good. Yeah. Good evening and welcome everybody. And good morning to the lady who is not here. So we begin our today's talk with this is our happy to announce that this will be our almost 135th webinar. So our aim is to complete 150 webinars by 15th August 2022, and hopefully I think we should be able to do it. So this is today Shruti ji is with us, and we will begin the program with a 1-minute invocation. We have the invocation ready.
Sarve bhavantu sukhinah, sarve santu niramayah, sarve bhadrani pashyantu, ma kaschit dukkha bhavet. Asato ma sadgamaya, tamaso ma jyotirgamaya, mrityorma amritam gamaya. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti.
Yeah, once again, I welcome you all to this webinar. For the understanding of those who are not aware of, not heard of Sri Aurobindo Complex Trust, it is situated in Bangalore, Karnataka, and we have about 31 centers and branches together. So this is a part of 150th birth anniversary celebrations. Dr. Shruti is with us. Dr. Shruti belongs to a family which is deeply connected with Sri Aurobindo and the mother. Her moorings were made stronger by her PhD and period which she spent in Pondicherry listening to various stalwarts in the ashram, society, Sakar, and Aurobindo. Her doctorate thesis was on Sri Aurobindo's poetics and aesthetics. From being a student of Sakar from 2007, she joined work at Sakar as assistant director in 2014 to serve here and grow closer to Sri Aurobindo and the mother. Shruti is also the assistant editor of the journal New Race, which was blessed by the mother in 1964. She is going to talk to us on the topic Sri Aurobindo's experiences and vision, Sonnets and Savitri. So, Shruti ji, the floor is yours. You will have about an hour time at your disposal. Subsequently, we will have a small chat with exchange of ideas and question and answers if somebody has. Thank you very much, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Ajit sir, and many thanks to Vaishali Didi also, to the entire JP Nagar Center in Bangalore. It is definitely for me a kind of homecoming because the first time I came to Bangalore was because you invited me there. And I had the good fortune to visit your center, give a talk, and also have lunch there with all of you. So it's a pleasure to be a part of this series of 150th birth anniversary of Sri Aurobindo. Now, the topic that I have chosen is Sri Aurobindo's experience and vision, Savitri and Sonnets, or rather Sonnets and Savitri. I got this idea maybe somewhere subconsciously. I was since I had heard so many people speak and give talks on Sri Aurobindo's Savitri. Somewhere I think I had registered that there is a resonance, there is a semblance between Sri Aurobindo's Sonnets and Savitri from various speakers, and perhaps that topic came up just out of some subconscious memory. However, when I started studying it, I realized that it was not just about putting together different sonnets and curling out lines from Savitri, but each poem or each sonnet vis-a-vis Savitri's lines can become a paper by itself, a big long article by itself. So I was quite thrilled, and in fact, what I'm going to present today is a kind of maybe a synoptical view, since my understanding through it has evolved since I started studying for this paper. So it is a kind of synoptic view of which are the sonnets I have chosen and what are the lines from Savitri which resonate with sonnets. Sri Aurobindo wrote, or Sri Aurobindo told the biographers who wanted to write his biography, "My life has not been on the surface for men to see." A very often quoted line from Sri Aurobindo. But at the same time, we are much interested to know who this great, grand Mahakavi, the great personality, Maharshi is. And the best way to know such a grand personality, such a magnanimous person, is through his works. And to our good fortune, Sri Aurobindo has left us with about 35 volumes. But what is most interesting is he says, "I have not written anything that I have not experienced or had a vision of." So that's why whatever we pick up from Sri Aurobindo, whether it's the Life Divine, the Savitri, the Synthesis of Yoga, Essays on the Gita, everything is his own experience. Especially I have brought forth Sonnets and Savitri because there is a first person involvement here. We see in Sonnets especially. Sri Aurobindo has written a lot of sonnets saying, I have experienced this, I have envisioned this. And that makes it extremely personal because at very few places Sri Aurobindo presents himself in the first person. So sonnets, as we know, for those who do not belong to the background of literature, is a 14-line composition it has evolved and has been brought out in different formats by different poets. Sri Aurobindo has evolved its forms, and he has written both the Shakespearean and the Miltonic kind of sonnets. Most importantly, sonnets written by any poet usually are used to convey any personal inner feeling, inner experience of the poet. So, what we learn from here is it is not a far off experience, it is not an experience or a feeling which is just has entered the poet, but he has ruminated over it. It is his own very personal experience. Similarly, we know Sri Aurobindo has written that Savitri also is the record of his seeing, his vision, his experience, and not only his, but it is the experience and vision of Mother and Sri Aurobindo both. It is the autobiography of both Mother and Sri Aurobindo. And there is a great resonance, as I mentioned in the beginning, of the lines, the experience of Sonnets and Savitri. Before we go on to the lines of Sonnets, a couple of points that we need to keep in mind would be, like, say, sonnets, which are written on a very individualistic level, assume a massive cosmic level in Savitri. We will see as we go along. There would be another component of the intensity of experience. At times in sonnets, the experience is extremely intense. In Savitri, it is elaborated, it is expanded. In fact, at times we will also see that there is a step forward to that particular sonnet experience. In Savitri, it's a step forward to that. We will go to the poems, all the experiences, and we will see how what I'm saying might make sense to all. Now, we are aware of the experience that Sri Aurobindo had in 1908 of the silence of the mind, of nirvana, and all, as he says, all other transmuting experiences that he had during those 3 days with Vishnu Bhaskar Lele. Of course, I do not know if he has written about all that happened during that time, but a couple of experiences he does mention, and that was the silence of mind, nirvana, the featureless Brahman, etc. So I would read a few lines from what Vishnu Bhaskar Lele told him and what happened later, and then how Sri Aurobindo has expressed this in Sonnet and Savitri. Sit in meditation, he said, but do not think. Look only at your mind. You will see thoughts coming into it. Before they can enter, throw them away from you till your mind is capable of entire silence. Further, Sri Aurobindo says something, and then he says, I flung them away before they could enter and take hold of the brain, and in 3 days I was free. Please mark the word where he says, in 3 days I was free. From that moment, in principle, the mental being in me became a free intelligence, a universal mind, not limited to narrow circle of personal thought or a laborer in a thought factory, but a receiver of knowledge and all the 100 realms of being, and free to choose what it willed in this vast sight empire and thought empire. The second half of this letter itself, if we analyze and look into what Sri Aurobindo has written after this experience, that itself will be a wonderful research for us. However, the impact of this entire thing, as he says, was in 3 days, really in one, my mind became full of an eternal silence. It is still there. Now, I would like to bring to your notice this poem, this sonnet called Liberation, where Sri Aurobindo says, I have thrown from me the whirling dance of mind and stand now in the spirit's silence free. My mind is hushed in wide and endless light, my heart a solitude of delight and peace, my sense unsnared by touch and sound and sight, my body a point in white infinities. I am the one being's sole immobile bliss. No one I am no one I am, I who am all that is. So this is the poem Sri Aurobindo wrote in 1938, and we will mark that when he is speaking about becoming a receiver, where his mind had become universal. So in this poem also, Sri Aurobindo says that I have thrown from me the whirling dance of mind. In fact, I did not read the letter fully, where he does mention that he could see the thoughts coming into his mind from outside, and he then flung them away. So that was the whirling dance which Sri Aurobindo stopped. He did not allow the thoughts to come in. And then he became one immobile, blissful being. Now in Savitri, a similar experience Ashwapati has. And what is again interesting is this is given in Book 1, Canto 3, where we see the yoga of the king, the yoga of the soul's release. His center was no more an earthly mind. A power of seeing silence filled his limbs, caught by a voiceless white epiphany, into a vision that surpasses forms, into a living that surpasses life. He neared the still consciousness sustaining all. As we all know that every time we read Savitri, we feel there are different meanings to different lines, and these can be read in different contexts. But when I read it in the context of this poem called Liberation 1 rather, and another poem which was called The Word of Silence, I felt that Sri Aurobindo is here resonating or is taking forward this experience where he says his center was no more an earthly mind. He was not limited into his mind, and the experience of becoming universal in mind is resonated here. So King Ashwapati or Sri Aurobindo, as we know, it's an autobiographical epic. So we see there is a semblance of experience. And of course, Sri Aurobindo explains with regard to the silence of mind, when the mind is silent, there is peace, and in peace, all things that are divine can come. When there is not the mind, there is the self, which is greater than the mind. So Sri Aurobindo had reached this stage where he had become quiet and he had become the self greater than the mind. Now, what is again interesting here is, at least it's my humble discovery, that we can actually read a few poems, a few sonnets of Sri Aurobindo in the context of Savitri, as well as the experiences that followed the silence of the mind. So thus, after the silence of the mind, or during that 1908 experience, Sri Aurobindo also experienced nirvana. He very clearly says that I experienced liberation and nirvana. So he has written, as we know, a poem called Nirvana in 1934. All is abolished but the mute alone, the mind from thought released, the heart from grief. There is no I, no nature, known, unknown. Only the illimitable permanent is here. A peace stupendous, featureless, still replaces all. Well, one can go on reading this entire. I would have read this poem many times before I even utilized it for this paper or selected it for this paper. But what was interesting is to understand here, perhaps Sri Aurobindo has mentioned in his letters two types of nirvanas. One is the Buddhistic nirvana and the other is the Shankarite nirvana. Of course, I cannot explain on those because I do not have any experience or a philosophic background. But what I understood is from Sri Aurobindo's own words, and I would read about this experience of what this kind of nirvana was. This was a Buddhistic nirvanic experience about which he wrote in the sonnet. And this was, there was no one or many even, only just absolutely that, featureless, relationless, sheer, indescribable, unthinkable, absolute, yet supremely real and solely real. So Sri Aurobindo says this nirvanic experience that he has had was of inexpressible peace, a stupendous silence, an infinity of release and freedom. So there was no sense of I there, because if you see in the poem also, he mentions there is no I, no nature, known, unknown. So one is completely annihilated, one is the person who goes through this experience of Buddhistic nirvana, in fact, Sri Aurobindo says, feels as if there were no such thing at all, only an infinite zero without form. That was his experience in this sonnet. And now, very interestingly, Sri Aurobindo has expanded this entire experience of the Buddhistic nirvana into a whole canto of Savitri, which is Book 7, Canto 6, Nirvana and the All Negating Absolute. I would read a few lines because we've already read the sonnet, and we would understand here how Savitri has undergone this nirvanic experience. She has ridden up from body, mind, and life. She was no more a person in a world. She had escaped into infinity. What once had been herself had disappeared. There was no frame of things, no figure of soul. Further, Sri Aurobindo writes, she shared the superconscious high retreat beyond the self-born word, the nude idea, the first bare solid ground of consciousness. Beings were not there. Existence had no place. There was no temptation of the joy to be. So this is exactly where Sri Aurobindo defines only an infinite zero without a form, or there is no individuality left, there is no cosmic consciousness, or the consciousness of anything around it does not remain with the person who experiences this nirvana, is what Savitri undergoes. And we all know that this condition she comes across after she had found her soul, after she is journeying into higher realms of consciousness and is moving towards what Sri Aurobindo would later tell us is called cosmic consciousness. And now there is an interesting link between what we read as liberation, then nirvana, and what is to come in Savitri called cosmic consciousness, or the canto on cosmic consciousness, and Sri Aurobindo's sonnet on the same. When Sri Aurobindo experienced this first level, or the basic level of nirvana, as he says, the first experience of nirvana, he said, I was in this state for quite some time. I could not think there was no existence of anything. He says there was no ego, no real world. Only when one looked through the immobile senses, something perceived or bore upon its sheer silence. So from this state, he says, I was in this state for quite a few months, and slowly, because he stayed in this state and he did not escape from this world, slowly his consciousness started admitting or recognizing or perceiving other things around. And that was the time when, not that was the time, but when he had been to Shankaracharya Hill. Of course, he went before, I think, 1908. So he had already experienced the Nirguna Brahman of Sri Shankaracharya. But I have linked it up here as Sri Aurobindo's experience of Nirvana with what he experiences at the Shankaracharya Hill. And the experience that he had was, all had become one strange, unnameable, an unborn soul reality, world nude, topless and fathomless, forever still, a silence that was being's only word, the unknown beginning of the voiceless end, abolishing all things, moment seen or heard. On an incommunicable summit reigned a lonely, calm and wide, unchanging peace on the dumb crest of nature's mysteries. What the connection that I'm trying to again make here is the state for not only Sri Aurobindo, but say for Savitri, where she has attained a Buddhistic nirvana, but now her consciousness has started admitting certain things from the outside world or from reality, and therefore the whole recognition of this world being, or maybe the recognition of reality, after which Sri Aurobindo says that there is a recognition that comes into him that the world is also real. Like in Advaita, he says the world is not real, but in his experience, slowly he recognizes after Nirvana that the world also is real. And there is a step forward that we read in Savitri after this. But now the unmoving wide spiritual space in which her mind survived tranquil and bare, admitted a traveler from the cosmic breadths, a thought came through draped as an outer voice. Now we see here the word that Sri Aurobindo mentions, admitted a traveler from the cosmic breadths. And this term, this word, admit, he also uses is in his letter, where he does mention that I did not admit anything in my consciousness as long as I was in this first stage of nirvana. So Savitri also was not able to admit anything. Her consciousness did not permit on admitting anything of any other consciousness or of the earthly consciousness. But when she stays on in this canto, book 7, canto 7, she is able to admit a traveler from the cosmic breadths. It called not for the witness of the mind. It spoke not to the hushed receiving heart. It came direct to the pure perception's seat, and only center now of consciousness. So again, this experience we see is fulfilled here when Sri Aurobindo says that he had become a channel, his mind had become quiet, his mind had expanded into becoming a universal mind. And in that consciousness, when he is admitting things, it does not mean that the stirring of the mind or the bazaar of the mind again starts working. He says that the mind is quiet. He called not for the witness of the mind. So mind per se, my mental consciousness as such was not required the way we are into. After meditation, we directly plunge into thoughts or the bazaar or the jungle of thoughts that we plunge into. Sri Aurobindo or Savitri, they did not get into this kind of a mode. They kept to their stationed consciousness as the silence of the mind. And then slowly what the consciousness which was recognizing was a center deep within. And only center now of consciousness, if center could be where all seemed only space. So of course, these are very complex lines to understand where is the center, which is the center deep within that Sri Aurobindo is talking about, or what Savitri is experiencing. But maybe we can further read and try and understand a little. No more shut in by body's walls and gates, her being, a circle without circumference, already now surpassed all cosmic bounds, and more spread into infinity. This being was its own unbounded world, the world without form or feature or circumstance. It had no ground, no wall, no roof of thought, yet saw itself and looked on all around, in a silence motionless and illimitable. All was a still and even infinity. In her, the unseen, the unknown waited his hour. So this is where we are seeing that slowly Savitri is recognizing, is admitting certain outside things from this status quo, from this quiet consciousness. Now, before we move on, a small recap of what I said in the beginning, that Sri Aurobindo's individual experience and expression and vision finds a cosmic scale here in Savitri. Now we'll see how. When Sri Aurobindo says, I walked on the high wayed seat of Solomon, where Shankaracharya's tiny temple stands, facing infinity from time's edge, alone on the bare ridge ending earth's vain romance. Around me was a formless solitude. Now here is the very personal aspect. Sri Aurobindo, the poet, the person who is experiencing, is there at the center of this experience. And that is how he has written this sonnet, saying, I am the one who is experiencing this. Now when it comes to Savitri, it is a third person narration, but it also has assumed a larger scale. Like when he says, a lonely, calm and void, unchanging peace on the dumb crest of nature's mystery is what is the poet's experience in the sonnet. And we see the expression here in Savitri. There was no person there, no centered mind, no seat of feeling on which beat events or objects wrought and shaped reactions stress. There was no motion in this inner world. All was a still and even infinity. So this sense of infinity, this expansive consciousness, this being in the unseen and unknown and waiting for the hour, although it is Savitri's personal experience, but Sri Aurobindo has scaled it up. I can only, I can only feel it when I read these lines. I may not be capable of explaining it in words or expanding it in words. Similarly, we see even this experience of nirvana, the mind from thought release, the heart from grief. There is no I, no nature, known unknown. Similarly, it is in third person written for Savitri. She has risen up from body, mind, and life. She was no more a person in a world. So there is a transference from the first person to the third person, and there is a largeness. The explanation, if we see, of this one experience of nirvana, Sri Aurobindo has converted into about 8 to 10 pages of the canto in Savitri. This one small sonnet called Cosmic Consciousness, as we will read next, Sri Aurobindo has again converted it into a canto. So we can imagine, or rather we cannot imagine, the magnitude of the experience that Sri Aurobindo has been through and how he has translated it for us in the form of a sonnet as well as Savitri. Now we go to the next. As I mentioned, silence of mind, nirvana, Advaita, and then cosmic consciousness. The sonnet. I have wrapped the wide world in my wider self, and time and space my spirit's seeing are. The world's joy thrilling runs through me, I bear the sorrow of millions in my lonely breast. I have learned a close identity with all, yet am by nothing bound that I become. Carrying in me the universal's call, carrying in me the universal's call, I mount to my imperishable home. We see the very personal touch of Sri Aurobindo here. I mount my imperishable home. I pass beyond time and life on measureless wings, yet still am one with born and unborn things. So this we see, if we do not read yet the lines from Savitri, we will see Sri Aurobindo's consciousness has expanded to such a large extent that he says that I am one with born and unborn things. And he also mentions this in his own letter that I have taken from what he writes to one of the sadhaks. When one has the cosmic consciousness, one can feel the cosmic self as one's own self. One can feel one with other beings in the cosmos. One can feel all the forces of nature as moving in oneself. All selves as one's own self. There is no why except that it is so, since all is the one. So this is his own experience, which he explains to a sadhak who would have asked a question about cosmic consciousness. And this is again, we see is mother's experience. If I have interpreted it right, of course, this is one of the stanzas of mother's, one of the poises of the mother. I'm not saying only this consciousness, but we come to know from elderly sadhaks in the ashram that when these young children used to, give blows to each other, they used to beat each other. And it is, the mother had once told them that it is not that to each other that you give blows, it is to me that you are giving these blows. They come to me. Similar is the case with Sri Ramakrishna Paramhans when he gets the beating, the pain that the bullocks go through when they are being beaten, and he gets the pain and the mark on his body. So such is the wideness, the width of their consciousness that mother can feel the punch of a child, or Sri Ramakrishna could feel the beating on the bull's back. That's the expanse. That's how we perhaps can understand a little of what it might mean. So this was Sri Aurobindo's consciousness. I yet still am one with born and unborn things. Now, it's wonderful that he also writes, I'm one with unborn things as well. Now, in Savitri, this is from, again, book 7, canto 7. Her spirit saw the world as living God. It saw the one and knew that all was he. She knew him as the absolute self-space, one with herself and ground of all things here, in which the world wanders seeking for the truth, guarded behind its face of ignorance. All nature's happenings were events in her. The heartbeats of the cosmos were her own. All beings thought and felt and moved in her. She inhabited the vastness of the world. Its distances were her nature's boundaries. Its closenesses, her own life's intimacies. So we see this description goes on and on in this canto, and where Sri Aurobindo writes towards the end, she was no more herself, but all the world. And for himself he wrote, yet I still am one with born and unborn things. So definitely there's a shift, not only in becoming the expression becoming a third person expression, a cosmic expression, but even when Sri Aurobindo has used, I have learned a close identity with all, yet I am nothing, yet am by nothing bound that I become. So there is this personal experience, the personal aspect of the poet involved in this. Whereas when he is writing about Savitri, one with herself and ground of all things here, in which the world wanders seeking for the truth. All nature's happenings were events in her. So we see he has expanded her experience not in saying that I have become identified with the world. Rather, he says that the world is happening in Savitri. So that's the huge, large platform we see, the cosmic platform of Savitri's being, where she was no more herself, but all the world. In fact, this is a stage that Sri Aurobindo says that comes in yoga, where all the limitations break and one soars into the cosmic consciousness. There's a letter that he has written on it. Now, in the same series, as I'm mentioning, the poems Liberation, Nirvana, Advaita, Cosmic Consciousness. In my understanding, there's one more, if we can add here, is the bliss of identity. Now, I must again say that these are my interpretations. This is my small understanding, little understanding of Sri Aurobindo's poems as well as Savitri. So we can always find other parallels. And in fact, I did initially when I started studying, I found a different set of lines which I felt were resonating with these poems. But then when I read it again and again and again, I changed those lines and I felt, no, the other ones were more appropriate, which I brought to you. Now, the result of this cosmic consciousness, we were seeing that Savitri has expanded, her spirit has expanded, she herself has expanded so much that the bodies, their bodies, her many bodies came to her. So that there was no differences in body also. The example that we gave of the mother getting the blows or Sri Ramakrishna getting the blows is where there's no difference between the mother's body and the children's body. That's the reason she gets those blows. And because of this, there's a bliss of identity. Because of this bliss of identity, there's again a change, there's again an expansion that happens in Savitri. So this poem, Bliss of Identity, I feel is a precursor to what we will read in Savitri now. So Bliss of Identity, a few lines. All nature is taught in radiant ways to move. All beings are in myself embraced. It is thy rapture flaming through my nerves, and all my cells and atoms thrill with thee. My body thy vessel is, and only serves as a living wine cup of thy ecstasy. I am a center of thy golden light, and I its vast and vague circumference. So it's very interesting. In the previous lines in Savitri, we saw that he speaks about Savitri as becoming a center without circumference. And here he says, and I, its vast and vague circumference. So This is the bliss that the poet is going through because he has become one with all the beings, where he says, all beings are in me, myself embraced. That's the joy that he has. That's the ananda that he has. Now we read the lines in Savitri, and perhaps you will agree with me that these are after the bliss of identity, this is what happens, or after cosmic consciousness, this is what happens to Savitri. Infinity was her own natural home. Nowhere she dwelt, her spirit was everywhere. The distant constellations wheeled around her. Earth saw her born, all worlds were her colonies. The greater worlds of life and mind were hers. All nature reproduced her in its lines. Its movements were large copies of her own. She was the single self of all these selves. She was in them, and they were all in her. So if we see very interestingly, just a few lines above, Sri Aurobindo says, she was no more herself, but all the world. And here's Sri Aurobindo writes, she was in them and they were all in her. And in the sonnet, he says, all beings are in myself embraced. So this I felt specifically these two lines from the sonnet as well as from Savitri, they resonate with each other. Where all beings are embraced in myself, the poet in first person is saying that all beings, and earlier he says the born and the unborn, all I have embraced. And here Savitri, she was in them and they were all in her. So this is really, I mean, while I'm reading itself, I'm feeling how much we have to think, how much we have to absorb this very magnanimity, the magnanimous consciousness of Savitri or the mother or Sri Aurobindo, and what she is, we can't even imagine. She was the single self of all these selves, and no wonder when the mother says, I am there with all of you, I am there inside you. Perhaps these are the lines to which we can relate to. She was the single self of all these selves. And of course, we can't really imagine that expanse of consciousness, that magnitude of consciousness, that experience that Sri Aurobindo is experiencing here. But there is a wonderful similarity between these lines here, which we've been reading past few minutes. And I feel extremely thrilled to, maybe we can do another research on she was no more herself, but all the world. And these kind of phrases where Sri Aurobindo has repeated it time and again, perhaps also with Ashwapati he repeats, and he does, where he says that Ashwapati has become one with the entire world. Because we also see in book 2, when Ashwapati is scaling the levels of consciousness, even in book 1, canto 3 and 5, 3, 4, 5, we see that the levels of his consciousness, his psychic realization, his psychic contact, all those things are shown step by step by Sri Aurobindo. We feel that, you know, there is this wonderful progression, and cosmic consciousness has first been attained by Ashwapati, and we see Savitri also going through that. The expansion of this explanation is more found in Savitri's context. However, there are lines which I had earlier called out, which speak about Ashwapati also becoming one with the entire world, that all mind, all thoughts, all nerves were throbbing in him. He could feel every nerve and cell of the entire world. And that's how when he says, the sorrow of millions in my lonely breast, I have learned a close identity with all. We see this exactly where Ashwapati also goes through, and he also is able to identify with the entire world, with the entire born and unborn world. So this forms a kind of, for me, it formed a sequel. It may not be for everyone, but I felt it was easier to trace it in this manner of experiences, since our title is Sri Aurobindo's Experience and Vision. So according to the sequence of experiences given in Savitri, this is how I have looked upon these few poems. Now there are other experiences. Of course, we will be able to find almost all sonnets being voiced in Savitri in a certain manner or another, or the experience is taken forward, but still another experience of the psychic being. That is again very interesting of how Sri Aurobindo has mentioned um, the presence of the psychic being in Savitri and the presence of the psychic being or his discovery of the psychic being in the sonnet. So we will move on to a few more sonnets now. There are two sonnets called The Guest and The Miracle of Birth. This is where Sri Aurobindo has spoken about his discovering of his psychic being. The Guest. I have discovered my deep, deathless being, masked by my front of mind, immense, serene. It meets the world with an immortal seeing, a God spectator of the human scene. I skip a few lines. Danger and fear, fate's hounds, slipping their leash, rend body and nerve, the timeless spirit is free. Awake, God's ray, and witness in my breast. In the undying substance of my soul, flame-like, inscrutable, the almighty guest. Now, I would like to bring to your notice a few phrases which are common in Savitri's explanation, and then we will move on to another poem called The Miracle of Birth, which resonate a few different terms and words here. Now, when Sri Aurobindo says in his sonnet, The Guest, the timeless spirit is free, or he mentions flame-like, inscrutable, the almighty guest. And here in Savitri, in Book 1, Canto 3, he mentions, a spirit that is a flame of God abides, a fiery portion of the wonderful, artist of his own beauty and delight, immortal in our mortal poverty. And we see here, Sri Aurobindo writes, it meets the world with an immortal seeing. So the terminology, the terms used by Sri Aurobindo in the sonnet as well as in Savitri are almost similar. He is mentioning, he's addressing psychic being as a flame like in his sonnet, and the flame of God in his Savitri. So there is this semblance. Then also he speaks about the aspect of immortality or the deathlessness or the deep deathless being that the psychic being is. Similarly, here also it's the immortal, that portion is immortal in our mortal poverty. So he's very much addressing the terminologies are the same. And also one very important thing that Sri Aurobindo here mentions, and I would like to highlight it here, is in Mother's and Sri Aurobindo's letters, we come across the impact of the psychic being on an individual. As and when the individual, a person comes in contact with the psychic or realizes the psychic or becomes psychicized, a great many changes come over onto that person. And this, of course, there is, Sri Aurobindo mentions that these changes Ashwapati also undergoes. I'm not going into those changes, but a feeling of constant kinship to immortality, constant joy, a spontaneity of love, compassion, kindness, a feeling of oneness with others, a feeling of light and inspiration, and a joyful quietude. These are some of the aspects, these are some of the impacts of the psychic realization. And this is all Sri Aurobindo, as we again and again have been mentioning, has experienced and written about in his letters, in the Life Divine, in the Sonnets and Savitri. So he does mention one important thing, that all the fear of death goes away from him. Danger and fear, fate's hounds, slipping their leash, rend body and nerve, the timeless spirit is free. So outside we are all fearful that we will face death or we will die one day. But when there is a kinship to immortality, when there is this feeling that we are immortal, or there is a center within each one of us which is immortal, then at that point in time we lose this fear. We are no more fearful, and that's why when we see a lot of ancient saints and sages in India, in across the country. Each state has they have wonderful and deeply realized saints in India. Each one of them, but they were fearless. They had no fear absolutely whether the king kills them or the storm kills them or the people do anything to them. They were absolutely fearless, and they were always in living in the joy of being, joy of the psychic being. So similarly, Sri Aurobindo also says that I am away from all this, no pain, no sorrow that can rend his heart. Here also, Savitri, of course, in Savitri, he doesn't go to that extent yet. I move on to another poem, The Miracle of Birth, in which we will see a few more parallels. I saw my soul a traveler through time. From life to life, the cosmic ways it trod. Obscure in the depths and on the heights sublime, evolving from the worm into the god. Now, we all know, we all have read Sri Aurobindo's In the Mother's Letters. Mother explains quite elaborately of how psychic being travels from life to life, how it evolves from life to life, what is its functions, what it accumulates, what it sheds off, what is the process of evolution of the psychic being, the letters that we have come across. Now here, this mention of from life to life, it is evolving. Sri Aurobindo has almost replicated these lines in Savitri, almost 5-6 lines below what I just read. Passenger from life to life, from scale to scale, changing his imaged self from form to form. He regards the icon growing by his gaze, and in the worm sees the coming God. So we see the similarity, the semblance, evolving from the worm into the God, and in the worm foresees the coming God. So even the expression here is similar. Further, in the transient symbol of humanity draped, he feels his substance of undying self and loses his kinship to mortality. We have discussed this kinship to mortality, etc., in context of the guest. So I feel it's very interesting to see how Sri Aurobindo's experience of this psychic being has been so beautifully, almost very, very honestly, has been transferred very unadulteratedly. In fact, not even by expanding, it has been transferred to Savitri. Now, there's another experience, another wonderful poem, um, which we have studied greatly. I mean, studied in the sense at Sakar, Dr. Anand Reddy, whenever he gives talks, he refers to it many, many times, and it inspires us a lot. That the poem is called Surrender. And I'll not read the entire poem, but the essence of it, we know that Sri Aurobindo says that I have made myself an empty instrument. I have, O thou of whom I am an instrument. And he has emptied, he has surrendered his mind, his will, his heart, his nerves, his body, his cells to the divine, so that the divine can do with him what he likes. And in fact, towards the end, he says, keep only my soul to adore eternally and meet thee in each form and soul of thee. This is, of course, I'm reading because it's the most wonderful lines, the conclusion of the sonnets, the sonnet. But now, again, after the poet has realized or has surrendered himself entirely, as we see this, I'll read a few lines and then we will see how Savitri follows up. I have given my mind to be dug thy channel mind. I have offered up my will to thy will. Let nothing of myself be left behind in our union mystic and unutterable. My heart shall throb with the word beats of thy love. My body become thy engine for earth's use. In my nerves and veins thy raptures streams shall move. My thoughts shall be hounds of light for thy power to lose. This experience of personal surrender in Sri Aurobindo's sonnet, we see in Savitri, when Ashwapati, in book 1, he mentions, I'm sorry, not in book 1, later in book 2, book 3, he mentions, A vast surrender was his only strength. Now, we can imagine the vastness of the surrender because of the poem that Sri Aurobindo has written, perhaps. The extent of the surrender, I would say not the vastness, but the extent, the intensity of his surrender, we can see in this poem, Surrender. And when we read further, we will see what happens because of this surrender. What is the follow up or the impact, or when we become an instrument, what may happen? That is what we read in Savitri. So I'm reading some lines from Savitri and then we will discuss it further. This is when Ashwapati starts realizing the coming of the Divine Mother coming closer to her. He has scaled the levels of consciousness. He has gone to that level where he can feel the coming of the Divine Mother. He can feel her footfall. And then a change comes over Ashwapati. All at her contact broke from silence's seal. Spirit and body thrilled, identified, linked in the grasp of an unspoken joy. Mind, members, life were merged in ecstasy, intoxicated as with nectareous rain. His nature's passioning stretches flowed to her, flashing with lightnings, mad with luminous wine. All was a limitless sea that heaved to the moon. A divinizing stream possessed his veins. His body's cells awoke to spirit sense. Each nerve became a burning thread of joy. Tissue and flesh partook beatitude. So we see the terminologies here, where Sri Aurobindo says, "In my nerves and veins thy rapture streams shall move." Now here in the sonnet, he says, "In my nerves and veins thy raptures streams shall move." And here on Ashwapati, the change comes over, and here the poet says, "Each nerve became a burning thread of joy, tissue and flesh partook beatitude." So already the what Sri Aurobindo had mentioned shall happen has happened or is happening with Ashwapati. Similarly, his body cells awoke to spirit sense. Here, of course, Sri Aurobindo does not necessarily use the term cells, but let nothing of myself be left behind. My heart shall throb with the world beats of thy love. So here also, he does mention in the lines, intoxicated as with nectareous rain, his nature's passioning stretches flowed to her, flashing with lightnings, mad with luminous wine. Further he writes, and filled with flickering crests and praying tongues, even lost in slumber, mute, inanimate, his very body answered to her power. Now that's something very interesting, because when Sri Aurobindo does mention, "My body become thy engine for earth use," in the sonnet he says, "My body become thy engine for earth use." And then in Savitri we read, "His very body answered to her power." And this could happen because of that vast surrender that Sri Aurobindo or Ashwapati had already made to the Divine Mother. So because of that emptiness, because of that becoming a perfect instrument, the Divine Mother he could feel the presence of the Divine Mother pervading him. So that was one beautiful experience, and in fact, perhaps we can have a close study of this surrender poem with all the aspects of surrender that Sri Aurobindo mentions in Savitri. Now, a couple of more poems, since we have 5-10 minutes more. There is a poem called The Dual Being. We know the very name suggests that it is about the Purusha Prakriti, the relation of Purusha Prakriti, and of course about what Sri Aurobindo would have realized in it, and a personalized account of his realizing the Purusha Prakriti. There are two beings in my single self. At Godhead watches nature from behind, at play in front with a brilliant surface elf, a time-born creature with a human mind. So we have this Purusha Prakriti, a Godhead watches nature from behind, and Prakriti at play in front. And we know the famous lines from Savitri: the two who are one are the secret of all power. The two who are one are the might and right in things. His soul, silent, supports the world and her. His acts are her commandments, registers. So this, up till here, we see, of course, the two who are one, and this is a long and wonderful description. All of us who have read Savitri would see long descriptions of the two who are one, what is their relation, what does Prakriti do, and how does the Purusha consent, or how does he witness the play of Prakriti, etc. There's another, I found a small reference to another poem, which the poem I will not read, but I'll just mention. His breast he offers to her cosmic dance, of which our lives are the quivering theatre, and none could bear but for his strength within, and yet none would leave because of his delight. So this is a reference to the cosmic dance of Sri Krishna and Kali that Sri Aurobindo mentions in his sonnet. Of course, the sonnet has a different tonality. It speaks about a different, the dance of Kali happening always, and he says, "When will I see the dance of Shiva, dance of Krishna, which will bring delight?" But here, if I'm not mistaken, of course, this also refers to Shiva, because the image of the cosmic dance, his breast he offers for a cosmic dance, is also referred to Shiva standing on Kali's breast while doing his tandav or during his creation. Kali standing on Shiva's breast, because he alone could take that force of Kali, and none could bear but for his strength within. So only Shiva could bear the strength. So these are the two poems on Purusha and Prakriti aspects. There's one more very interesting poem which I found a bit difficult to find, but then when I started looking for lines in Savitri, there were quite a couple of places I found, but I have found here, brought only one, which is called The Inconscient Foundation. In fact, from the very first canto of Savitri, we start seeing that Sri Aurobindo does mention that there is this something in the inscrutable darkness stirred and teased the inconscient to awake the ignorance. So those kind of lines, when we see the very inconscient base of this evolution that we see, and that's what Sri Aurobindo says, that he had a vision, he had an experience. My soul regards its veiled subconscient base, all the dead obstinate symbols of the past. The hereditary molds, the stamps of race, are upheld to sight, the old imprints effaced. In a downpour of supernal light and reeds, the black inconscience enigmatic script, recorded in 100 shadowy screeds, the inert world's obscure enormous drift, all flames, is torn and burned and cast away. So I am not going to the experience necessarily here. I take it as a vision of Sri Aurobindo, and it's parallel in Savitri. This is in what Savitri experiences in this parable of search for the soul. Nothing is wholly dead that once had lived. In dim tunnels of the world's being and in ours, the old rejected nature still survives. So here, when Sri Aurobindo speaks about this in the sonnet, all the dead obstinate symbols of the past, the hereditary molds, the stamps of race are upheld to sight. Of course, he's saying that the old subconscious is coming up, but here also in Savitri he says, nothing is wholly dead that once had lived. Similarly, for inconscient he says, a portion of us lives in present time, a secret mass in dim inconscience gropes. Out of the inconscient and subliminal arisen, we live in mind's uncertain light and strive to know and master a dubious world whose purpose and meaning are hidden from our sight. So in fact, what's interesting, if I were to understand, in the sonnet, Sri Aurobindo is able to see the dumb inconscient, the subconscient of this creation. To his vision, everything has come up. Whereas here in Savitri, he is explaining again from a third person perspective that this is this is a subconscious basis of our existence, an inconscious base of our existence, but it is hidden from our sight. So what the poet is able to see in the poem, or even in Savitri, he has not yet, at least in the lines that I read, has revealed to us of what is there hidden in subconscious or the inconscient basis. So that's again, as I said, a semblance of the lines, a semblance of the experience and the vision that Sri Aurobindo has translated. And one last poem here, which will again have some semblances in terms of the phrases that Sri Aurobindo has used. And the sonnet is called The Golden Light. I will read only the 4 lines that will resonate with Savitri next. Thy golden light came down into my brain, and the grey rooms of mine sun-touched became. So first is the brain. Thy golden light came down into my throat, and all my speech is now a tune divine. This is about the golden light coming in his throat. Next, thy golden light came down into my heart, smiting my life with thy eternity. The heart. And then the last is the feet. Thy golden light came down into my feet. My earth is now thy playfield and thy seat. And we know from Sri Aurobindo's letters, golden light is the light of the divine truth descending from above. He also mentions that it refers to the supramental consciousness at times, but there are many different shades and there are many different meanings that he has given. That's why I did not bring those quotations here. Now, when in Book 1, Canto 5, Ashwapati has scaled those wonderful levels of consciousness, and he has made himself an empty vessel for the divine to work on. He says, or what happens to him is, his being now exceeded thinkable space. His boundless thought was neighbor to cosmic sight. A universal light was in his eyes. The golden influx flowed through a golden influx flowed through heart and brain. A force came down into his mortal limbs. A current from eternal seas of bliss. He felt the invasion and the nameless joy. So we see the experience of sonnet here is actually compressed in 4 lines, or the 14 lines are compressed in 4 lines. The golden light that came into his brain, into his throat, heart, feet, has come into here, Sri Aurobindo says, a golden influx flowed through his heart and brain. A force came down into his mortal limbs. A current from eternal seas of bliss. He felt the invasion and the nameless joy. So we see here that the golden light which descended, or the supramental light which descended on the poet, on Ashwapati, on Sri Aurobindo, has brought in some changes, has captured his entire being, and he has felt that invasion and the nameless joy, because it is a force that has come on him, but it has brought in tremendous joy, tremendous ananda. So now to recapitulate in what all we have analyzed here between sonnets and Savitri, I felt there was this beautiful combination of the personal poet in sonnet, the yogi in sonnet, and the great Kavi whose vision we see as the magnum opus in his epic Savitri, which is a cosmic vision. We know that Nolinida and Mother, they have spoken of this as a cosmic epic. So Savitri is a cosmic epic, and Sri Aurobindo's sonnets are his personal experience about, he has written about his personal experience. And sometimes the intensity of sonnets is heightened in Savitri, sometimes it is elaborated in Savitri, sometimes it is all pervading in Savitri. So we see that this experience is carried forth in Savitri. Sometimes as my little analysis that I have been seeing, some experiences which Sri Aurobindo had written about in the sonnet, he speaks kind of the lines that I chose, they show how after that person experience there is a there's an expansion or there's a further experience in Savitri. The intensity in the lyric or in sonnet is because of the brevity of experience, of intensity of experience, and fewer words which need to capture the entire experience. Whereas in Savitri, he has a large, large cosmic canvas, the epic grandeur, the epic scale, in which he can write lines on end. He could write lines on end as he was scaling the levels of his consciousness. Again, what is most fascinating, what has been most fascinating for me when I was studying through all this, was both are his experiences, both written in poetry, both have semblances, and yet both show sometimes two different yet similar aspects of Sri Aurobindo the Kavi or Sri Aurobindo the poet. A very personal note in sonnets, and a very impersonal, a very third-person note, a very cosmic note in Savitri. So we see these two aspects of Sri Aurobindo, the Mahakavi, Sri Aurobindo, the great yogi that we have been celebrating this year in the 150th for his 150th birth anniversary. So this is, as I initially mentioned, is only a synopsis of what can be done further, and anybody can take a research on that, or time permitting, we will do it at Sakar. But it's a very, very interesting research to see the relation between Sri Aurobindo's experience, sonnets, and Savitri. I'm sure we will find a lot of rich experiences from Record of Yoga also, but in my little understanding of Record of Yoga, I could not make use of that resource as yet. So I thank again the JP Nagar Center for giving me this opportunity to study Savitri and Sri Aurobindo's sonnets so deeply and closely. And I'm again grateful to Dr. Anand Reddy for guiding me through this. I used to get stuck with understanding with my limited reading, etc. But he helped me. He suggested me books, etc. to read. So thank you once again. Vaishali Didi, thank you for all the support and calling me in for this. Ajit sir, many, many thanks. Thank you.
It takes some time to settle in, Shruti, thank you so much for your deliberation on the subject today. In fact, it was truly a very refreshing approach, I would say, in understanding and absorbing Sri Aurobindo's spiritual experiences through his, in a kind of parallel drawn between sonnets and Savitri. In fact, you touched upon several of his sonnets, establishing a kind of link between the two extremes of our existence, microcosmic and macrocosmic. And I feel that his sonnets are probably more easily comprehensible and equally blissful. And I always felt that before reading Savitri, I think everybody should take up and read these sonnets and try to understand, and then probably get into Savitri. That will be probably the link will be much more firmly established. And I was recently reading, Baji Prabhu. You have a complete different personality of Sri Aurobindo, and it's so amazing how Sri Aurobindo is able to bring in the Veera Rasa, in his poems. So wonderfully deliberated on the subject, Shruti ji. Thank you so much. And I'm sure I should directly or indirectly, I'm sure Anand Bhaiya would have guided you, helped you, and probably molded you into such a beautiful personality. I thank him also. And now I think we will open it for some interaction. If there's some interaction or observation or any clarification that is there, let us have it.
Ajit sir, just one note. In fact, I had the good fortune of doing a research on rasas in Baji Prabhu. So we had published that article in our journal New Rays, and again under the guidance of Dr. Reddy, he said, since my subject was aesthetics during my PhD, so he said, why don't you find out some rasas in Baji Prabhu? So I did do a little bit of research on different rasas there.
You can probably present it one more time.
Sure.
Next opportunity. It will be lovely to hear that. Dear friends, let us open it for interaction. Now, Shruti is before you, and kindly go ahead. Please unmute yourself and then. Sorry, I think I was muted. Kindly introduce yourself, and you can go ahead speaking. Any questions? Need not necessarily be questions only. I think we can share our views on any aspect of Sri Aurobindo's, because we're all family members here.
I guess Savitri is too self-absorbing, and Savitri is too absorbing as such.
Yeah. Or probably you have dealt it so well that there are no questions, no clarifications required. Anand Bhaiya, would you like to say something?
You have to unmute yourself.
Unmute yourself.
Well, Shruti has done a good job as my good student.
Yeah.
So the teacher feels proud. However, yeah, it's been a very novel approach, I think, because I was trying to see, I was telling Shruti, do we see a different personality between the sonneteer and the great epic writer of Savitri? Or is it the same personality? Is there any growth of consciousness from one time to the other? But there we saw that most of the sonnets that she has referred to are after 1935. And Savitri, the real part of the Savitri is the 1935 onward. Before that, there was a smattering of Savitri here and there, some versions. But the finale, the final end came after 1935. So it is important to see who is this sonneteer and who is this writer of the epic. I mean, it's trying to see the microcosmic and the macrocosmic, they are going simultaneously in Sri Aurobindo? Or was it really, I mean, it's a kind of a lab test that he was having in the sonnet, was experiencing the essence of it. Then he expands it into a kind of a universal cosmic level, applicable to, on a cosmic level. So there is a beautiful combination of the individual and the universal, these two aspects, So, because as we have seen, as you also noted in Baji Prabhu, there's a different personality. So, Sri Aurobindo is that magical personality who comes to us with different ways of his, features, and maybe he says you enjoy the individual, go ahead. As you yourself mentioned, there's a greater beauty and a greater depth of joy and all that in sonnets. Yeah, you can kind of, I had a teacher of mine in higher course who would at all times, whenever he says whenever he was in trouble. In fact, once he was during the independence time in jail. He says at that time he learnt all the sonnets of Sri Aurobindo, which gave him a great amount of peace, because he used to recite those sonnets and one after the other. So what I want to say is the sonnets bring in almost a kind of a meditative mood. There's a kind of a consolation, some kind of a solace, not a consolation, solace. And Sri Aurobindo, as I said, he changes his rupa, where he fits your mood. If you're in a solitary mood, this had a sonnet. If you are to go to the forest, a meditative mood, you have Savitri. I mean, he fits into your own meditative consciousness. Meditation, whichever you want to do, sonnets or Savitri. But I was myself amazed. So I told Shruti, I said, try to focus on why these two are different aspects. And did Sri Aurobindo purposely do this necessarily? Or is it that he didn't even know that he was going to write Savitri later on? And so on the spot, it was, like Wordsworth tells us what's the definition of poetry? Recollected in tranquility, some kind of poetry. What is that, Shruti? What's the line? Recollected in tranquility, Wordsworth?
Spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings recollected in tranquility.
So these sonnets are that. It's a spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings recollected in tranquility. So it's a powerful experience which gives a voice, a kind of a rhythm, a kind of a tone in sonnets. And this spontaneous overflow is not there in Savitri. It becomes a kind of a cosmic living. He kind of reaches that level of the cosmos, and then from there again he sees himself. So it's a beautiful play of a personality in sonnets and in Savitri. And you cannot say this is greater or that is greater, because as you also pointed out rightly, the intensity of sonnets is kind of unparalleled. I mean, each line, and I come back to my famous line, keep only my soul to adore thee eternally. I mean, I'm zapped by the single line. It's so simple, so almost prosaic, but the amount of devotion, surrender that is there. So that intensity is not there when Ashwapati says that is his strong surrender. What is this? Surrender was his only strength or something.
Vast surrender was his
A vast surrender. You see, that line, a vast surrender is his only strength, cannot be compared with this one. So when there's a question of a personality, individual, then we can relate to him. Whereas Ashwapati is saying a vast surrender is his only strength, I don't relate. But this line I always relate to my God. He says, you take everything, but keep only my soul to adore the eternal. It's a supreme line. I mean, I would say of all the sonnets line, this is the line. As the mother says in Savitri, she chooses that famous line, forever love, O beautiful slave of God. So to each one is different. Mother is not cosmic consciousness, so she chooses that. I'm in the individual consciousness, I choose this one forever to keep only my soul. Well, I don't know to give another talk on Savitri. I mean, you get kind of carried away,
Yes.
Right, Ajit? Just thank you for the comment.
Yeah, I feel, Anand Bhaiya, that probably in sonnets we find some kind of a seeding that happens from Sri Aurobindo, and then which grows into a massive tree when it comes to Savitri. But as you rightly said, here it almost goes parallelly. I think that is the speciality of.
That's why we cannot see the speed and the growth.
Yeah. Now there is no. So that's why we can say that it is beyond time and space.
Because that's why immediately I said, when were the sonnets written?
Yes.
After 35.
Yes.
At the same period, Savitri is being written.
True. Very true. Very true. So anybody would like to say anything? Okay, Shruti ji, then I think let us wind up. If there is nothing, then thank you very much once again. Thank you, Anand Bhaiya, and thank you all the participants for having come today. And let us, I think next important function at Sri Aurobindo Bhavan is in JP Nagar. Is our Relics Day, which happens to be on 11th June. Of course, before that, we have quite a few programs. So let us meet again, either on the web or physically. So thank you very much for being with us once again.
Bye.
Thank you.